August 1945, Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. The noon heat lay heavy in the pines, resin sharp on the air, diesel coughing from parked deuce-and-a-halves, and from the camp kitchen, a warm sweetness drifted out that did not fit any memory the newcomers carried from Europe. Women in field-grey auxiliaries and white-edged nurse smocks, captured weeks earlier, routed by ship through the Navy's Atlantic ports and down by rail, shuffled forward with tin cups and aluminum trays. At the head of the line, the cooks worked fast, ladling beans, slapping meat, sliding out yellow squares from a steaming pan. A ripple ran through the Germans, quick smiles, a hand to the mouth to hide it. Tierfutter, someone breathed without meaning to. Pig feed. In Bavaria, maize belonged to animals. Bread was rye's dark weight, not this sun-colored cake that broke along a crumb. Pride flared out of habit. So did hunger, louder. The first bites were cautious, pinched from corners. The second came warmer, butter softening the edges. By the time trays scraped clean, the same women who had snickered were asking if there might be more. The United States had built an empire of camps by 1943, dotting Georgia alone with compounds at Benning, Gordon, Stewart, Wheeler, and here, at Oglethorpe, where enemy prisoners learned the American rhythm of mess call and calorie-rich plates, even in wartime scarcity. New Georgia Encyclopedia. The post itself had trained thousands of WWIIs through 1945, its barracks and kitchens scaled for volume. The ovens did not care whose uniforms filled the chow line. Fort Oglethorpe was 1-1. What happened on this humid day seemed too small for a war measured in divisions and tonnage, yet it marked a quiet break with propaganda. Defeat did not taste like cruelty, it tasted like cornbread. From this table we will walk back, how these women were taken, what they had been told to expect, and why a Southern staple became their first lesson in mercy. March 1945, the war's last spring. In the valleys of the Moselle, and along the roads that led west from Trier and Koblenz, the grey columns of Germany's collapsing army stretched for miles. Among them marched not soldiers in helmets and rifles, but women in wrinkled auxiliary uniforms, clerks, typists, and field nurses who had followed the Wehrmacht from barracks to battlefield. They belonged to the Nachrichtenhelferinnen and Luftwaffenhelferinnen, communications and Air Force auxiliaries, whose duty had once been to record messages, patch radio lines, and tend the wounded. When the Allied lines broke through in France, their role ceased to exist. The front dissolved, and so did the illusion that uniform meant protection. By April, at Verdun and Nancy, hundreds were herded into improvised enclosures, abandoned rail yards fenced with barbed wire, guarded by men scarcely older than themselves. American soldiers who met them were unsure what to make of this new kind of prisoner. They carried no weapons, and yet they had worn the insignia of the Reich. The Geneva Convention extended protection to non-combatants, but the paperwork lagged behind the reality of capture. Reports from the 6th Army Group described large groups of female auxiliaries requiring immediate transport, and within weeks, orders were issued to move them from temporary camps in France to permanent ones overseas. In early May, the women were marched to Cherbourg, where Liberty ships waited among the wreckage of U-boats and scuttled freighters. The crossing took 12 days. Grey water and diesel fumes filled every waking hour. Rumors multiplied in the dark that they were being sent for forced labor or sterilization or public display. One nurse later recalled staring at the Atlantic and thinking, "So this is the grave of our empire," but the shores they reached were nothing like the imagined inferno. At Norfolk, Virginia, they were met not by jeering crowds but by medical officers with clipboards, who processed each arrival through delousing showers, vaccination stations, and uniform exchanges. Everything moved with mechanical precision, frightening in its efficiency but not cruel. From there, sealed trains carried them south. Through the windows they saw endless pine forests and red earth, small towns that smelled of sawdust and coffee, and children waving at the passing cars. It was not kindness yet, but it was not vengeance either. Still, as the train slowed before a sign reading, Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, no one believed the ordeal was over. They were prisoners now, stripped of purpose and nation, uncertain whether mercy was simply another illusion waiting to break. Summer 1945, Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. The camp sat on a rise of red clay and pine shadow, its perimeter traced by double rows of barbed wire that glittered under the noon sun. From a distance it looked every inch a prison, yet as the new arrivals stepped through the gate, escorted by Women's Army Corps guards in pressed khaki, they found something that unsettled them more than hostility: order and plenty. The compound spread across acres of trimmed grass and wooden barracks, each neatly numbered, with screened windows and bunk-lined interiors. A chapel stood near the center, its steeple modest but real. Beside it, a library with English and German volumes stacked in disciplined rows. A recreation hall echoed faintly with piano music, an instrument, one nurse noted later, that should not have existed in a cage. Established in 1904, Fort Oglethorpe had trained cavalrymen before the First World War, then housed conscientious objectors, and later the Women's Army Corps. By 1945, it had become one of the largest female internment centers in the country. Its barracks expanded to hold roughly 700 German women, Red Cross workers, medical aides, typists, and clerks drawn from the ruins of the Reich. Army records noted rations fixed at the same standard as U.S. troops, 3,500 calories per day, a logistical policy mandated by the 1929 Geneva Convention and applied with bureaucratic precision. Breakfast was eggs or cereal, lunch meat or beans, supper bread, coffee, and something sweet. For women who had lived through air raids and shortages, the smell of frying fat alone felt unreal. From beyond the fence, trains could be heard grinding toward Chattanooga, their cars filled with the grain and meat that fed America's home front and its prisoners alike. Some women whispered that this abundance must be propaganda, a calculated display meant to shame them into moral collapse. But the truth, stripped of suspicion, was simpler. The United States could afford mercy. Its war machine, built on industry and agriculture untouched by invasion, was vast enough to feed even those who had served its enemy. Within weeks, the rhythms of camp life softened. The same hands that had once transcribed field reports now peeled potatoes beside American cooks. Laughter began to breach the language barrier, tentative but genuine. The fence still stood, but the atmosphere within it had changed, from confinement to curiosity. The transformation would soon find its symbol in something as humble as food itself, a southern staple the prisoners had never imagined as edible. June 1945. Midday heat pressed against the barracks roofs of Fort Oglethorpe, carrying with it a scent the German women could not place. It was sweet, faintly nutty, and unlike any bread they had ever known. The mess bell clanged, and they filed into line, aluminum trays in hand. Behind the steam tables, American cooks worked in rhythm, sleeves rolled high, spatulas scraping across wide metal pans. From one pan came the source of that smell, golden squares, firm at the edges and soft at the center. To the cooks it was routine, War Department recipe number 424, the standard issue for cornbread baking powder type. Each batch blended cornmeal with wheat flour, powdered milk, lard and reconstituted eggs, baked until the tops browned just shy of crisp. To the Americans it was comfort food, as essential as the coffee that followed it. To the Germans it was a puzzle. Corn maize was fodder in their world, the grain of pigs and poultry. No German cookbook worth its salt had ever listed it under brot. One clerk stared at her tray and whispered that it must be a trick, a deliberate humiliation disguised as hospitality. Others snickered softly, that it looked like cake that had forgotten how to rise. But hunger by then was stronger than suspicion. Forks broke the crust. The texture was foreign yet inviting, its sweetness faint but unmistakable. What began as derision became silence, then curiosity, then embarrassingly appetite. Within minutes, trays were empty, and the line formed again for seconds. That evening the ovens fired once more. The smell drifted through the compound and settled between the bunks. Some of the women wrote in their notebooks that night, trying to reconcile what they had tasted. It reminded me of home, one nurse recorded, but without arrogance. The irony was not lost on them. The same grain they had dismissed as unfit for humans had become a gesture of dignity from their captors. The cornbread had no flag, no ideology. It was simple, nourishing, and unpretentious, a quiet sermon in carbohydrates. In that warmth, the rigid lines between victor and vanquished began to blur. What had started as a mystery of ingredients became a lesson in humanity, one bite at a time. The story would soon expand beyond food, revealing how the American handling of prisoners became its own theatre of moral display. By midsummer 1945, Fort Oglethorpe's kitchen ran like an extension of the Quartermaster Corps' vast, invisible machinery. Nothing about the meals was accidental. Every portion, every substitution, every calorie followed the arithmetic of Article 11 of the 1929 Geneva Convention, which demanded that prisoners of war receive the same food as the troops of the detaining power. What sounded moral on paper became logistical doctrine in practice. The Office of the Provost Marshal General issued weekly menu charts, columns of numbers and weights calculated down to the ounce: 12 ounces of meat per day, 1 pound of potatoes, 6 ounces of vegetables, 10 ounces of bread, and a daily dessert allotment. When wheat shipments tightened, the directive permitted regional substitutions, and so in Georgia, cornbread filled the gap where loaves might have been scarce. Across the United States, the Quartermaster Corps sustained more than 400 POW camps by 1944, serving over 425,000 German captives. Each consumed roughly 45 pounds of food a week, more than most civilians in occupied Europe could dream of. The scale astonished even the Americans who prepared it. "The army eats last," the cooks at Oglethorpe liked to say, but in truth the system ensured that even enemies ate well before want ever reached the mess hall. For the women behind the wire, the experience defied every rumor carried from Europe. Propaganda had painted Americans as material gluttons, cruel in victory, and careless in conscience. Yet here were measured trays, clean utensils, milk powder in abundance, and officers who counted calories as if compassion were a science. The abundance was more than policy, it was performance. American officials understood that feeding one's captives well was a kind of ideological broadcast, a quiet rebuttal to the brutality reported from Axis camps overseas. The meals became moral theatre, proof that democracy could conquer without hatred. Still, for the German women, ideology mattered less than immediacy. What lingered after each serving was not a political message, but the physical warmth of food, the sameness of mealtime routine, the small decency of being fed without contempt. In that repetition, suspicion began to dissolve, replaced by something unspoken, a fragile bridge built from starch, salt and the hum of an orderly kitchen. The rhythm of that kitchen would soon define the camp's daily life and the subtle exchanges that unfolded within it. By autumn 1945, the mess hall at Fort Oglethorpe had become something more than a feeding station. It was a classroom without chalkboards, where two worlds met across long pine tables, stained by coffee rings and cornmeal dust. The women who had once lined up in silence now moved with purpose between stoves and mixing bowls. The American cooks, mostly farm boys and WWII auxiliaries from Alabama, Tennessee, and the Carolinas, had discovered that teaching their captives to help in the kitchen eased both labor and tension. Under their guidance, German hands learned to measure by the cup instead of the gram, to stir batter until it looked right, to listen for the crackle that meant the fritters were ready. In return, the prisoners shared what years of deprivation had taught them: how to stretch cabbage into a stew, how to coax flavor from bones and vinegar, how to bake rye bread without yeast. Language became less of a barrier than a pretext for laughter. One day's confusion between butter and batter ended in a spilled bowl and an hour of shared amusement. The guards noticed it first: the smiles, the absence of tension that had marked the early weeks. Reports to the Provost Marshal's office that winter described high discipline, low hostility, a bureaucratic phrase that barely hinted at the quiet camaraderie forming behind the wire. The same women who had once ridiculed cornbread now requested it on Sundays, sweetened with syrup when supplies allowed. In those moments, the divide between conqueror and captive seemed to evaporate in the steam of boiling kettles. For the Americans, these prisoners ceased to be symbols of an enemy ideology. They were nurses and typists who missed their families, who hummed lullabies while washing pans. For the Germans, the men and women in khaki were no longer caricatures of excess. They were people who salted food with their own hands, who worked until their aprons matched the same flour-specked grey. The power dynamic remained, but it softened under routine. By December 1945, when the camp celebrated Christmas with turkey, potatoes, and cornbread stuffing, few could hold back emotion. The meal was both foreign and familiar, a reminder that comfort was not the privilege of the victorious. Tears fell quietly across the tables, glinting in the light of rationed candles. The feast did not erase defeat, but it revealed something gentler that would carry into the final months of captivity, the realization that the enemy's generosity could sometimes taste like home. By February 1946, the frost still lingered on the Georgia hills, but a new sound had begun to stir in Fort Oglethorpe's barracks, the clatter of typewriters and the scratch of pens. The Red Cross had restored official mail service for the German detainees, and for the first time since their capture, they were allowed to write home. Paper was rationed, envelopes stamped censored in thick blue ink, but the words that crossed those pages were freer than any the women had ever written under their own flag. What emerged was astonishment wrapped in restraint. "We are well fed," one nurse confessed. "Even corn tastes good when it is warm and soft." Another assured her parents that the guards are not cruel, they are curious, even kind. Between the lines, these letters carried something radical, proof that defeat did not have to mean degradation. When they reached Germany, smuggled through Red Cross pouches into a nation of ruins, their tones struck like thunder. The cities they reached, Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, were starving. Ration cards barely covered 1,000 calories per day. To families living on turnip soup and sawdust bread, the idea that prisoners across the Atlantic were eating 3 meals and writing cheerful letters seemed surreal, even blasphemous. Yet those words chipped away at what remained of the Reich's mythology. The regime's last functionaries had warned that surrender meant slavery, humiliation, annihilation. Now came first-hand accounts of American mess halls serving meat and coffee, of libraries and Christmas feasts, of laughter between captors and captives. For the Americans, these letters became an unintended but potent message, soft power written in cursive. Allied policymakers cited them in reports to Washington as evidence that humane treatment fostered goodwill and would ease post-war reconstruction. For the women themselves, the correspondence was not propaganda but closure. Some enclosed crude translations of the camp's cornbread recipe, replacing cornmeal with barley or oat flour, improvising mercy from memory. Food, once a symbol of humiliation, had become a metaphor for grace, a taste that transcended politics. As winter yielded to the first soft rains of spring, the orders for repatriation arrived. The women packed their uniforms, folded their letters, and prepared to cross the ocean once more, not as instruments of an empire, but as witnesses to its undoing. The story that began with disbelief at a mess hall table would soon end with the journey home, where victory and mercy would meet in memory's uncertain light. April 1946, the red clay roads outside. Fort Oglethorpe glistened with spring rain as the first convoys rolled out toward the railhead at Chattanooga. After nearly a year behind wire, the German women were going home. Repatriation had begun under the supervision of the War Department and the International Red Cross. Its procedures, as precise as their capture, had been chaotic. Each prisoner received a medical examination, vaccination record, and a small issue of new clothing, American wool skirts and plain blouses, meant to replace the threadbare remnants of the Reich. Before departure, the camp mess hall served a farewell meal, beans, coffee, and one last tray of cornbread. This time there was no laughter of disbelief, only quiet nostalgia. What had once seemed humiliation had become comfort. Photographs taken that week by the Army Signal Corps show improbable scenes, German auxiliaries and American WWIIs standing shoulder to shoulder, smiling at the camera. A few exchanged badges, others addresses. Many carried home notebooks filled with English words, sketches of the camp layout, and recipes copied from the mess hall board. The most popular among them was for cornbread, annotated in pencil, "Mace meal if none. Use barley flour." On the voyage back to Bremen, aboard Liberty ships now stripped of their camouflage paint, they shared these fragments like relics. Conversations drifted between nostalgia and fear, the softness of American bread, the laughter in the kitchens, the taste of butter, and the dread of what waited across the Atlantic. When they finally stepped onto German soil, the contrast was brutal. The port was grey, skeletal. Cities beyond it lay hollowed by fire and famine. Ration cards allowed barely enough to survive, and many returned prisoners were regarded with suspicion, as if captivity itself were a moral failing. In letters and interviews later archived, The women recalled feeling that they had lived in a dream, fed, respected, even befriended, only to wake in a country that no longer knew how to be gentle. U.S. Army repatriation reports quietly noted a marked pro-American sentiment among female detainees. No speech or pamphlet could have achieved what food and fairness had done. The victory that emerged from Fort Oglethorpe was not written in treaties or flags, but baked into simple loaves of cornmeal, served warm, without malice. The next chapter follows that legacy as it rippled through post-war Germany's collective memory, where mercy became a measure of civilization itself. In the years that followed their return, the women of Fort Oglethorpe rarely spoke of barbed wire or guard towers. What survived instead were stories told in kitchens, folded into domestic life. A mother would describe, while stirring soup, how the Americans measured flour with coffee cups. Another, baking for a holiday, would mention the strange golden bread that had once seemed beneath her dignity. For the men who came home from other camps, captivity stories were often heavy with shame, their gratitude mixed with bitterness. But among the women, the memories of Georgia took on a different tone, neither patriotic nor apologetic, but quietly transformative. In oral histories recorded during the 1950s, several former auxiliaries described Fort Oglethorpe not as a prison, but as a place where order became gentleness. They spoke of the mess hall smell, the music in the recreation hall, the guards who laughed without mockery. Cornbread, das gelbe Brot, the yellow bread, became a kind of shorthand in those retellings. It embodied the paradox they could never quite explain, that a nation so vast and industrial could also be intimate in its mercy. In the 1960s, German newspapers ran nostalgic essays with titles like Das Brot des Friedens, the bread of peace, recalling how the simple southern staple had taught captives that victory did not have to taste of cruelty. Some women passed the recipe to their daughters, substituting barley or millet for cornmeal, calling it a peace bread. To historians, these recollections later seemed dangerously sentimental, smoothing the edges of a brutal war. Yet their emotional truth was undeniable. Food had done what ideology could not. It had humanized the enemy. In memory, the flavor of defeat remained faintly sweet, a reminder that even the smallest act of decency can outlast the empires that fall around it. From here, the narrative widens beyond Georgia, tracing how this philosophy of humane sustenance evolved into official American policy in the decades that followed. In the aftermath of the war, as Europe struggled to feed itself from the ashes, the United States discovered that sustenance could serve as strategy. The same Quartermaster Corps that had kept prisoners alive now became an instrument of diplomacy. Its ledgers, once filled with camp rations, turned into blueprints for the Marshall Plan. In 1947, warehouses that had stored Army surplus flour and cornmeal were redirected toward relief kitchens in Germany, Austria, and the Low Countries. Quartermaster data from that year recorded not only tonnage and calories, but also recipes, War Department menus repurposed for reconstruction. Among them was the humble cornbread formula from Fort Oglethorpe, adapted to local ingredients and baked in school basements and church halls under banners that read, UNRWA Food Mission. For many who had once been behind the wire, these relief kitchens were déjà vu. Some former German prisoners, now repatriated and fluent in English, returned as translators, cooks, or assistants for American relief agencies. In feeding others, they closed an invisible circle. The captives turned caretakers, the recipients of mercy now its instruments. It was, in its quiet way, a repayment. What began as compliance with the Geneva Convention had evolved into the doctrine of victory through abundance. By the early Cold War, military theorists and policymakers alike recognized that generosity could extend influence more effectively than fear. The idea that bread could be as potent as bombs seeped into American operations from Korea to Vietnam, from aid convoys to psychological warfare manuals. Fort Oglethorpe's story thus became more than a historical footnote. It was an early case study in moral power. The cornmeal that once marked captivity had turned into a diplomatic symbol, a small golden square representing the durability of compassion. Today the camp's grounds lie quiet, its barracks long gone, the parade fields reclaimed by grass. Yet somewhere beneath that soil, lingers the memory of ovens burning through the night, of meals served without hatred, and of a nation testing its conscience through the simple act of feeding those it had conquered. The next section returns to those memories, no longer policy or history, but personal recollection, where the women of Fort Oglethorpe, decades later, remembered how mercy first tasted. By the 1980s, the war had receded into yellowed photographs and folded flags. Yet for a handful of women once held at Fort Oglethorpe, the memories still breathed with color and scent. Some returned through exchange programs and heritage tours, sponsored by veterans associations and local historians. They arrived as elderly guests rather than prisoners, white-haired, dignified, speaking fluent English learned decades earlier from mess hall conversations. The fort they remembered no longer existed. Its barracks had been dismantled, its parade grounds converted into parkland bordered by quiet residential streets. Only the concrete foundations and a single interpretive sign hinted at what had once stood there. But when the women stepped across that grass, the years seemed to collapse. At the remembrance gatherings organized by local volunteers, cornbread and coffee were served, the same humble pairing that had first greeted them in captivity. The gesture, simple as it was, carried an emotional weight that silenced the crowd. One former nurse, interviewed in 1987, wept openly as she tasted the bread, saying it still carried the shock of compassion. For the Americans in attendance, teachers, retirees, students from nearby colleges, it was often the first time they had heard of the camp at all. They listened as these former enemies described their imprisonment not as trauma but as awakening, a lesson in decency delivered through food and fairness. Oral histories recorded at the Chickamauga Museum captured their words with quiet reverence. "We learned democracy by taste," one woman said. "You cannot hate the people who feed you kindly." In their voices, captivity had transformed into testimony, a proof that mercy, once practiced, could outlive the machinery of war. As the last of these women passed away in the 1990s, their stories joined the larger human archive of World War II, a reminder that the smallest gestures, warm bread, a shared table, can rewrite the boundaries between conqueror and conquered. The narrative now turns toward reflection, seeking to understand what such moments reveal about power, empathy, and the fragile arithmetic of moral victory. History records victory in the language of armies. Divisions advanced, flags raised, treaties signed. Yet the truer legacy of war sometimes lingers in something humbler, a taste, a scent, a memory passed from hand to hand. For the women who once sneered at the yellow bread of Georgia and later asked for seconds, cornbread became more than food. It was the moment ideology collapsed under the weight of experience. In that sweet, coarse crumb lay a revelation, that mercy could taste as real as hunger. That defeat could arrive not with lashes but with warmth. Across the decades, that meal endured in letters tucked into family drawers, in handwritten recipes carried across oceans, in recollections that softened the edges of history. Each retelling became a quiet defiance of cruelty, a proof that compassion can be deliberate policy as much as spontaneous grace. The ovens of Fort Oglethorpe have long since cooled, the barracks dissolved into grass and memory, but the lesson they baked endures. Strength measured by destruction fades. Strength expressed through generosity endures. The story ends where it began, in the heat of a southern mess hall in 1945, with the smell of baking cornmeal rising through wooden rafters. Across that room, a line divided captor and captive, but for a moment it no longer mattered. One shared thought hung in the air, wordless yet complete. Even in war, humanity still knows how to feed itself.